Hello everyone, welcome to Pisces Guide to Pop Culture. I'm of course your host TJ. Now it's been a while since I've done a romantasy, so I thought I would review today T. Kingfisher's Stoneheart, which came out a few years ago, but it seems to have gotten a new release with lovely sprayed edges, which we know we love here at the Pisces Guide. And I have to say that, as has been the case with everything I've read by T. Kingfisher, that I absolutely adored this novel. A few brief words of summary. It focuses on the character of Hala, who is a widow who ends up inheriting a sort of significant fortune from a great uncle, or her dead husband's great uncle, who seems to have kind of adopted her. Unfortunately, she is basically imprisoned by some other relatives who think that, the money should be theirs, and she's going to be forced to marry her clammy-handed cousin. However, things take an unusual turn when she unsheaths this sword that she's inherited, and it turns out that it's inhabited by this very powerful warrior named Sarkis, who becomes her guardian, and of course, as tends to happen, they end up falling in love. And so the novel largely follows them as they attempt to get her fortune back, largely through the help of the rat priest Zale. No, they are not a rat. They serve the rat god, but are a very skilled lawyer, and so they manage to get that back. And there's lots of adventures they have along the road. So it's very much a sort of traditional epic quest narrative, except it's very much more narrower in focus than your traditional epic. Now, I really enjoy the way that Kingfisher manages to capture so many different kinds of fantasy storytelling. Like, there's obviously the quest, but there's also romance. There's also a bit of a fairy tale element to it. Kingfisher really excels at blending these different elements into a coherent and really quite captivating whole. It's the kind of book that, there's a lot of world building. It's clearly, a fully fledged universe in itself. But it's really the dynamic and the relationship between Sarkis and Hala that is the real heart and soul of this book. And it's also worth noting that Hala is herself a middle-aged woman. Now, we don't see middle-aged women a lot in fantasy, and we certainly don't see them a lot in romantasy. For that matter, we don't see them a lot in pop culture. We do more than we used to, but there's still a sort of understanding that once you get past a certain age, that you're not really desirable, or at the very least that you shouldn't be headlining your own sort of romantic narrative. But Kingfisher is clearly pushing back against that, and I love Hala as a character. She's relentlessly inquisitive. She's also very knowledgeable, and she understands the role that women play in this world, and so she's quite able to make use of that when the need arises. And she very quickly falls under Sarkis' spell, as much the same way that he falls under hers, and he makes for a fantastic romantic hero, tortured and grim, but also very emotionally invested in Hala and making sure that she survives and that she gets her rightful property back. And I think there's a lot that's enjoyable about this book. I just felt myself drawn into this world. I loved these characters. I loved both Hala and Sarkis, obviously, but they also have a priest, Zale, as I mentioned earlier, and Noel, who's this, there's a sort of badger-like species, so they have a relationship with them, and it's all very fun and all put together in a very nice package. Like I said, it's the romance, though, that really drives this novel, and we know that I love a very good romantic story. I love a slow burn narrative, and that's very much what we have here. It does take each of the characters quite a while to figure out exactly how they feel about each other, and there are more than a few setbacks. But what I also find really, sort of unusual about this novel is that, the real bad guys are Hala's relatives, as well as this sort of, religious zealot priests that constantly accost them on the road. And I think that what makes this novel so compelling in that regard is that rather than this sort of big, bad, monstrous evil, we have here the true banality of evil. The worst people in the world are, generally speaking, people driven by religious zealotry and people driven by greed and who want to exploit their family members. I think that there's something potent about that message that we don't... a lot of fantasy, and a lot of, this kind of fantasy in particular, is very much about those sort of bigger existential questions, but here we have a much more grounded, much more narrower focus, and I don't mean that pejoratively. I think that's actually a good thing, and it's something that Kingfisher does very well in her various works. It's true in Thornhedge, it's true in What Moves the Dead. I think that they excel at these really deeply personal, deeply nuanced psychological portraits of characters moving through these fantastic worlds. And I think that's really enjoyable. I think that, fantasy as a genre is obviously very grounded in character, but also in world building, but, sometimes the latter sort of takes the privilege over the former, and it's nice to see that not be the case here. So, in short, I did really enjoy this book. It is, again, Swordheart, which is, again, I love this cover, too. And so I also appreciate this as a last note, that there's also a very like horror section once these characters inadvertently find themselves in this very strange region called the Vagrant Hills, a sort of otherworldly kind of geography that tends to migrate, and they meet these slimy creatures. Anyway, it's very eldritch, very body horror, as the way that Kingfisher tends to do, so it's nice to see that even in this fantasy setting. So, in other words, I really did enjoy this book. I think you will too, especially if you're like me and you're a fan of Kingfisher's other work. Definitely check it out. Like I said, it was published a few years ago, but has been re-released with this lovely new cover that I think really does justice to the nature of the story, which is very much, like I said, fairy tale, but also epic. And so, lots to enjoy about a good romantasy. Kingfisher is truly one of today's greatest living fantasy writers. I will go to my death saying that. Anyway, that's all I have for today, for today's edition of the Pisces Guide to Pop Culture. Do check this out. It does get my seal of approval, which we all know is the coveted thing for all things pop culture. So, as always, I'm your host, TJ. Thanks again so much for joining me, y'all. And, as always, take care, y'all.